Hello, I'm Dawn Durham, and welcome to PaTTAN. There's an awful lot going on nowadays. Our mission remains providing quality education to students in a safe and welcoming environment. PaTTAN is excited to welcome Pennsylvania's Acting Secretary of Education, Noe Ortega. Mr. Ortega, thanks for joining us on PaTTAN today.
Thank you, Dawn. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Many of our listeners may be hearing you for the very first time. And as that, we want to think about how would you want to introduce yourself to those in the field and let them know who you are and what you're about in order to connect with you a little bit.
Sure. So I'll start, Dawn, if it's okay, with the brief pronunciation of my name, which is Noe Ortega. It's one of those three-letter names that a number of folks have a hard time figuring out how you pronounce it. So it's going to be an interesting thing that I'll make work for myself as the new acting secretary at the Pennsylvania Department of Education. I am a lifelong learner, as well as a lifelong educator. And I think that to me is sort of my orientation to the work. I will, just to be completely transparent, my socialization and education has been primarily through higher education. So a lot of the lens that I look at is through the lens of post-secondary institutions, from your four-year public privates to your community colleges to some of your private licensed schools. That is by and large where most of my professional development has occurred. Additionally, I would probably also add, Don, that it's also been in the area of access for historically underrepresented students, right? A real lens that comes from the aspect of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I think those kind of round out who I am in a nutshell.
I think that's so important to mention that you are a lifelong learner, and education is something that you are dedicated to and have been dedicated to and will continue to have that dedication moving forward. So thanks for introducing yourself to our listeners and to those in Pennsylvania. I think it's important for them to know who you are. On that note, as Acting Secretary of Education, you set the tone for our schools, for our students, for our communities. Where are we going in Pennsylvania? What's your vision for the Department of Education?
Sure. And so, one of the things that I want to emphasize is that having spent, several years under this administration, under the previous secretary, many of the things that we continue to do were things that we committed to early on in the administration, right? So these are values around making sure that all students have access to high quality educational opportunities in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So that, of course, will continue. What we might be seeing as different is we're obviously in a situation where we have been displaced from the familiar approaches to in-person instruction and learning at our schools, at our post-secondary institutions, pretty much in the entire sector of education. So I think there's going to have to be a lot of reorienting ourselves to schools and schooling. What we were familiar with, there's going to be the case that there may be young folks who never met their new teacher, who will be coming in a whole year advanced, not having even met their colleagues and students. And that's a long time for a young person to be out of something that seems familiar and more routine. So there'll be a lot of reorienting that we'll have to figure out and work closely with our school partners on. And then we need to figure out how to put folks back on the path of success. What we're looking in terms of disruptions, and this is not exclusive to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the entire globe is being affected by the pandemic. We have to find ways to make sure that populations, particularly those that were most affected by the pandemic, get put back on a path to success to allow them to continue with the development that's necessary for them to be successful and productive citizens.
So we think about that, it's making sure that very first priority is making sure that all students have access to a high quality education is critical for Pennsylvania. And you're right, we are moving through reorienting everyone to the world of education, as it's going to and has been looking very different for us. And I do appreciate that priority of putting every student back on the path of success and making sure that we identify what is that path and how do we get back there. So thank you for that. You
Sure.
talked about this, and I just want to draw our attention because, this is something that's real and we have to face reality. We have been in uncharted territory for just under a year now. We do have a global pandemic that is causing and creating new situations for us in education. And I know the goal, and the goal always will be to put students and their learning first. I think our listeners, though, need to hear from you as acting Secretary of Education. What are you doing? What's the Department of Education doing to ensure that the safety of those in our schools, from students, teachers, staff, visitors, are safe, and that learning continues to that path of success?
Sure. And I think it's important to also orient the role of the department in the pandemic as well, right? In some sense, I consider the department as the sense maker for all our educational stakeholders when it comes to mitigating the dangers, the challenges that the pandemic is offers. And I do think that the pathway back to safety does begin with us as a agency taking advantage of all the resources available to us to reconcile sort of the real-time emergence of information. There's a lot of information coming at us. A lot of it is new and it's ever changing. It creates a great deal of uncertainty and ambiguity. And in many ways, school leaders, educators, families, and students themselves are trying to figure out, how do you reconcile this information with the needs and expectations that you continue to have of our schools and school leaders? And for us, it's very important that we find ways to take what we're seeing at the federal level, take what we're seeing in terms of development in the areas of research and practical application in other countries, and then begin to put that together in a way that's manageable and digestible to our school leaders. It requires a great deal of engagement with our stakeholders, Don. We have to constantly reach out and try to help them make sense of some of this information. And it's basically how we try to ensure that folks are creating a provision of learning for young children that's safe, but also conducive to learning. We continue to find ways to get schools back on the path to what looks more familiar, right? And for many folks, that's in-person instruction, face-to-face learning. But we need to do it in a way that's safe for all students.
Yeah. Now, I appreciate you kind of identifying and really laying out what is the role of the Department of Education. And I do appreciate, and I think our listeners will as well, that you're taking in what's happening at the federal level and really looking at what's the path that Pennsylvania is going to take to continue for safety guidelines, to continue to guide everyone towards success. And as you had talked about earlier, kind of reorienting ourselves to what does school look like and getting back to what we feel is more traditional for most of us, which would be face-to-face instruction. So thank you for laying that out. Absolutely. I do have to say, I have heard that the Pennsylvania Department of Education is engaging in a new initiative. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you all are launching a podcast series called PDE Presents. Would you tell our listeners a little bit about that and why that podcast series is going to be different and something they want to grab onto?
Sure, Don, and I appreciate the opportunity to share that update with your listeners. We have been talking a great deal about how important it is for us as an agency representing education to find ways to reclaim the narrative around education, right? The past several years, we've seen a tremendous amount of dialogue, public discourse, with people questioning the returns of investment on education, right? Particularly post-secondary education. We also have a lot of challenges with regards to folks feeling left out of the system, right? Inclusiveness has been a really big conversation. Thinking about school climate, also thinking about other issues that have to do with equity, diversity, and all the aspects that are playing out in our school systems all the time. So the idea was we can begin by taking one of the most obvious strategies into consideration, which is go out there and start reframing the public narrative around education, elevate the importance of our schools, our educators, our school leaders, and then highlight how schools have often been the places where innovation happens, deliberative dialogues occur, particularly among pressing issues. This particular podcast is being aired during a time where many of us have witnessed a tremendous amount of disruption sort of in the public narrative. And I think it's important for us as educators to understand that it's our role to help young people make sense of what they're observing. And so what this podcast will do is it'll take contemporary issues and concerns in higher education, reframe them from sort of an equity lens, and then invite school leaders, educators, and other community stakeholders to tell us what is their plan for addressing some of these issues that are emerging, and how are they going to use education as a way to make society better, to make young learners more actively engaged civic citizens, and make us all better citizens of society. So that's hopefully the end goal. It's a very ambitious goal, Don. I'll put that out there, but I think it's a necessary goal.
I do. I like this reclaim the narrative, particularly in education. I think that is, it's ambitious, but needed. It's needed. And I think you're right. In a time like we are living in currently, those elevated voices need to be heard. And we do need to think about what can the Department of Education offer, but what can the other stakeholders bring to the table to help reclaim that narrative. So PaTTAN Pod is excited to partner and officially launch PDE Presents for the department. We're very excited for what the future of this podcast series holds, and we're excited to be a part of that with you. So thanks for letting PaTTAN Pod join you.
Don, thank you as well. We're looking forward to the partnership as well. Thanks.
As Acting Secretary of Education, it's vital that our listeners hear from you across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So thank you, Mr. Ortega, for joining us on PaTTAN Pod today.
Thank you as well, and thank you to your listeners.
Thank you to all of you who are out there in the field. You are truly an inspiration to all of us. A special thank you to John Ragsdale for producing this podcast. We'll see you next time on PaTTAN Pod.